take the question that what you're really after is what are the major problems facing democracy as democracy? Because we could think about something like the environmental crisis, and then we could say, well, obviously that is a major problem facing democracy, but it's a major problem facing any kind of regime. We don't have to be Democrats to face that problem. We're all facing that, irrespective of what sort of country we live in. And then the question, I think, becomes if there's something about democracy that makes, for instance, the environmental crisis a particular kind of problem, or is there something about the environmental crisis that makes it a particular problem for democracy as opposed to other kinds of regimes? I would like to introduce a caveat because the question may also suggest that we think about democracy as a kind of set of institutions or principles or regime or whatever that is meant to solve problems. And my fear is that if we think about it in that way, we start sort of instrumentalizing democracy. And then you get these people who will say that, well, democracy, it's not really working, is it? Maybe we should get a sort of authoritarian regime so that we can make sure that we get the right decisions and that somebody takes a decision. And that seems to me very problematic. So it's not that I'm saying that democracy shouldn't solve or address problems. It's not that, but there's this risk if we think about it in that way. But maybe a different way of thinking about democracy would be to say that, well, okay, maybe, let's say for the sake of argument, let's say that democracy is about the rule of the people, where when we say the rule of the people, we mean something like the rule by the people in some way. And obviously there can be many different ways of conceptualizing that. There can be many different ways of institutionalizing that. But then two basic problems become what is the people and also what is rule. And if we start from that, then maybe we can think about democracy in a slightly different way, because then democracy becomes basically an open question. So what is democracy? Well, it depends on what your answers to those two questions is. What is the people? Who is the people? And also, what is rule? What does it mean to rule and to be ruled? So then it becomes much more open what democracy is. Obviously, there's also a risk here, because it means that democracy is continuously at stake, so to speak, because it really only is democracy. It really then only is the answers to those two questions: what is the demos or the people, and what is rule. So democracy comes like one big question, right? And then you can get all sorts of different answers to those questions, and we can't really say a priori what should be the limits to those answers. And we can easily start imagining sort of answers to those questions that we might not think of as really democratic, but then again, what is the yardstick against which we compare those answers to? Right? Is there some kind of... I would say there's no independent yardstick, no independent concept of democracy that we can use to say, okay, no, your answer to this question of who the people is undemocratic. And obviously there's a risk there, and I think you see that, among other things, you see it in these contemporary debates about populism. So populism is often seen, especially in Europe, as a threat to democracy. So there's the argument that populism, what happens with populism is that you have a populist leader, or populist party, populist movement that usurps the power of the state, But at the same time, it has been democratically elected, at some level at least. So what do you do there, right? I don't think that populism is necessarily a threat to democracy. In many ways, populism might actually be positive for democracy, depending on what kind of populism we're talking about, obviously. But the risk is there, and I think populism makes the risk of democracy visible in these situations. But it's not an issue that's specific to populism, because you can also think about a more technocratic form of democracy, where you will also have answers to those questions. What is the demos? Who is the people? And what does it mean to rule? Answers that, in a sense, close down what democracy defines it, and thereby close down and eliminates possibilities. So I'm thinking of democracy in this kind of tension between a certain kind of openness, where it's always where you have those questions about what is democracy, what is rule, what is the people, and at the same time you always also will have some answers to that, and thereby some kind of closure to that. And it's a closure that means that we are going down a certain path that makes other possible answers to those questions, if not impossible, then at least more unlikely. That's a very long-winded way of saying that I don't really want to answer the question, or at least I'm hesitating when I have to. But if I were to try to answer it, I would say that there are two major problems. I would say one would be something like we could call the environmental crisis. On many different levels, in many different forms, and the other would be inequality, something like inequality, and they are linked, because the environmental crisis, the effects of that are not evenly distributed across the divide between rich and poor and across different generations, and they are problems. They are major problems for democracy. In the case of the environmental crisis, the question becomes, okay, but who is the people there? How do we include in the people that is supposed to rule? How do we include future generations? But also, how do we include everybody, rich and poor, equally? And that's also a way of saying that inequality is a problem for democracy, because if we are thinking about democracy as the rule of the people, then it's one thing to include everyone, but usually not everyone is not included equally. And that's, among other things, that's an effect of some social and economic inequalities that then have effects within the sort of language schemes that we call democratic, or within political institutions, or in civil society more broadly. Not that I would want to limit democracy to what we call usually political institutions or political practices. We should also think about democracy in the family and in the university and in any kind of workplace. Yes, but with the caveats that I started out with in terms of what does democratic mean and so on. Okay, so I would want to put that in quotation marks and in brackets. But then I think maybe kind of going back to this question of populism, but without talking about populism, we would have to think about the all affected in the sense of, okay, how is this all affected articulated in terms of the people of democracy that is supposed to rule. And so we would have to think about different ways of articulating this people, or whatever we call it, in such a way that it could potentially include all those affected by the rule of democracy by a certain decision. And then there's a strand of political theory that would say, well, but what we need is a form of cosmopolitanism, a form of global democracy. That's one option, but I don't think it's necessarily the only one, and it's perhaps more relevant, at least today, from where we're starting from, and maybe also more I don't know, useful to think about a more sort of federate structure, where we would think about different peoples or different groups that connect to one another across, but on a horizontal level, in order to get that kind of effect of including all affected, without necessarily having a global state or some sort of institution that reaches everyone, but which the risk would be that it becomes detached from our particular experiences in our everyday lives and in our life worlds.